I'm humble. Thank you very, very much. I also want to just say that what I will do here has a kind of double commemorative aspect. And one commemorative aspect has to do with remembering our friend Qadri Ismail. And I say that in this context because the seed for this paper emerged from a conversation with him, one of our last conversations. He was working on a book on cricket and was struggling through a chapter on the use of baila as a kind of musical form in these matches. And we were talking about how to approach it, how to think about what kind of textuality it represented, if any, and how one worked with that sort of thing. What I'm doing here is I'm sort of elaborating on the questions that arose for us about thinking the relation between sound and musical performance. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there is a link, perhaps an unbreakable link, to that person and those conversations. The other commemorative aspect has to do with the fact that I mentioned the fact that there is a way out of the Hotel California. It's called retirement. And I will be retiring at the end of this academic year. Now, I don't know what that means for us, but it will be an opportunity to think a break in the continuity. So it's there on the horizon, and I wanted to mark it at the outset. So, minor differences. I always, when I'm invited here and I'm asked to speak, and I know what's gone into creating the conditions for that to take place, I always think, you've got to sit down and come up with something. So this may be a bit more than something, and I apologize if it's a lot to listen to, but I really feel as though I owe it to you. The epigraph is from Roland Barthes. It reads in English, "To equalize, democratize, homogenize all such efforts will never manage to expel the tiniest difference, la plus petite différence in the French, the seed of racial intolerance. For that, one must pluralize, refine continuously." And there are several themes there that I'm going to come back to in a kind of quiet way, but I just sort of wanted them there at the outset. Lately, I've been thinking about tuning. I began down this path when considering what Heidegger has to say about the German term Stimmung on the pages of Being in Time, where he draws on it to clarify how human consciousness is structured so as to perceive what it comes to engage as the world. Not, I stress, the world out there, this or that world, but the worldliness of human consciousness. That is, its radically inner orientation outward. Especially striking in this discussion is Heidegger's reliance on a sonic Stimmung, if not musical figure, for the articulation of the human and the inhuman. I am, of course, aware of and sensitive to the dangers of phonocentrism, Stimmung is called Stimme, or voice, and the dubious aesthetics of immersion, but what remains valuable here is the notion that sound and listening are irreducible aspects of what are now meant by biopolitics. And thus, to one of our themes, the minor, especially as it might be contrasted to and with, as others have said, the subaltern. Adorno's Kafkaesque closing paragraph to On Popular Music also states the relevant issues, but with different accent. It bears citing at some length. Quote, present-day mass reactions are very thinly veiled from consciousness. It is the paradox of the situation that it is almost insuperably difficult to break through this thin veil. Yet truth is subjectively no longer so unconscious as it is expected to be. This is borne out by the fact that in the political praxis of authoritarian regimes, the frank lie in which no one believes is more and more replacing the ideologies of yesterday, which had the power to convince those who believed in them. Even the belief that people today react like insects and are degenerating into mere centers of social conditioned reflexes still belongs to the facade. In order to become a jitterbug, or simply to like popular music, it does not by any means suffice to give oneself up and to fall in line passively. To become transformed into an insect, man needs that energy which might possibly achieve his transformation into a man. End quote. The intertextual allusions to Kafka's widely read essay, The Metamorphosis, are as clear as is Adorno's characteristically snotty, even unwoke tone. But note that dance music is here deftly invoked as the philosophically apt means by which to think the politics of what he calls the present day. Moreover, and this is surprising for Adorno, the human energy, what Marx quietly called life power, Lebenskraft, given form to in the jitterbug, is here advanced as precisely the energy required for passing through the thin veil of an unre-enchanted humanism. As with his great adversary Ernst Bloch, in this formulation the utopic impulse is already with us, and not to put too fine a point on it, it is sounding in, but also as music. Aware that I routinely take for granted Walter Benjamin's important insight about the need to approach burning questions indirectly, I will be blunt for a change. If I begin with these observations about music and society, is in order to prepare the swerve that follows, namely, my commitment to pursuing the matter of the minor I wish to do in strictly musical terms. So I'm basically just presenting what Sinaso was saying. If I begin with these observations, I will confess that I'm not entirely sure that this swerve will go anywhere terribly useful. But part of what it constitutes, I think, is the vitality, a form of the vitality of the Winter School project, and in its unique status as a performance space, a setting in which thought experiments are not only tolerated, but encouraged. To sustain this gesture of co-creating a topic and its topos, it seems pertinent to return, even if briefly, to the animating distinction between the minor and the subaltern framing our conversations this year. I largely agree that these concepts require differentiation, but I would put a stronger accent on the matter of effect than that of method. In other words, both the subaltern and the minor designate the effects of imminent alterity, the situation whereby constitutive exclusion opens possibilities of critique and resistance. So attending to the specificities of such possibilities becomes the means by which to articulate the detail of what might be called minor differences. Now I'm going to really try to define what I mean by that in the course of this. I also note here I've used the word detail, and I know that Haiti is going to develop that this afternoon. So important here, and I'm merely channeling the long history of Gayatri Spivak's defense of the concept of subalternity, is forgetting the false problem of whether the subaltern can speak. Or put differently, the issue is not whether those designated subalterns can talk, but whether their talk counts. That is, whether they can be heard, with all of its several epistemological, technological, and philological resonances. Accepting the common, even banal distinction between listening and hearing, one is then prompted to speculate about whether the concept of the minor sharpens our attention to what is at stake in listening to the subaltern. Vital here is the matter of the minor as such. Theoretically speaking, one is drawn here to the various formulations to be found, as others have already done, in the corpus of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Specifically, in the wake of their discussion of Franz Kafka, their association of the minor with the difference between a constant variable and a continuous variation. Well, that's not a theme we've been picking up much on, but I think it's an important one. The minor embodying continuous variation. Kafka's writing qualified, even defined the minor in expressing the consistent escape of German, its grammar, its lexicon, its sociolex, from itself. In 1,000 Plateaus, and we haven't really yet taken this one up, but there is also an important discussion of the minor. In 1,000 Plateaus, these insights are expressed in a manner that deserves more emphasis, I think, than they have received. In teasing out the minoritarianism of Québécois French, they write, quote, "It is also said that the Québécois language is so rich in modulations and variations of regional accents and in games with tonic accents, it sometimes seems with no exaggeration that it would be better be preserved by musical notation than any system of spelling." As this discussion deftly drifts toward a consideration of Afrikaans, I reserve the right to return to it, but at this point I wish only to draw attention to the terms modulation, variation, and tonic. These are distinct lexical anticipations of their point about musical notation, a point sharpened when later they write, quote, "The closer a language gets to this state of continuous variation, the closer it comes not only to a system of musical notation, but also to music itself." Important here is less the contrast between orthography and notation and more the simple fact that although the minor is theorized as expressive as music itself, there is no effort made in their work to explore the minor musical key as such. While the performative gesture of allowing this critique of linguistic representation to, as it were, go without saying, it's a clever move, but it's inadequate. So I'm going to try to take that seriously. As a musical key, and unlike the major key, the minor exists in three modalities. The minor has long been the object of a certain affective interpretation. Thus, when Feuerbach lamented our persistent recourse to adjectives when reading musical listening, he may have actually been implicitly privileging the evocative status of minor keys. At the very least, said privileging appears to have been inscribed as the enduring attempt to articulate its distinctly affective specificity. And it's this link between the minor and affect that I'm going to trouble. Consider, again in the Western context, Descartes' early rumination on musical keys and attendant scales. Known most widely as the sign donor for philosophical rationalism, that is the Eurocentric reduction of human subjectivity to the cogito, the I think, and its distinctive conjugation of certainty. One of Descartes' very earliest texts, indeed his first Latin publication, was a meditation on music titled Compendium Musicae. Exchanged with his friend Beekman, it attempts to think the arithmetical measure of music, and in this it follows in the trajectory of Pythagoras, which means, among other things, that it attempts to set out the rules for reflecting rationally on music as human-produced and received sound. I find striking its immediate and unabashed integration of affect into an otherwise formal meditation and arithmetical calculation. Here are some of his founding formulations as they appear in the opening section. Quote, it's not in Latin, "The object of this art is sound. The end to delight and to move various affections in us. For songs may be made doleful, tristes, and delightful, delectabilis, at once. The means conducing to this end, or the affections of a sound, are chiefly two. The differences thereof in the reason of duration, or time, and in the reason of its intention and modification into acute, actum, or grave." Now, this is where he's getting major minor going. Okay? This only thing seems to render the voice of man the most grateful of all other sounds, that it holds the greatest conformity to spirits. Thus also is the voice of a friend more grateful than of an enemy, from sympathy to a dyspathy of affections. So he's winding up a whole series of things that are very interesting here with this distinction, major minor. It's not hard to discern here the essential conclusions of phonocentrism, namely that the human voice, precisely in its proximity to the spirits, has the potential for being the sound most rich in what constitutes its gratefulness, but of even more decisive import here is Descartes' invocation of the friend-enemy distinction as a crystallization of the doleful, delightful affects as terms through which to define the ends of musical expression. If Carl Schmitt is correct, even vaguely correct, in thinking that the friend-enemy distinction has long served as an organizing polarity of political thought, then Descartes is implicitly urging modern readers to hear politics in the distinctions between doleful and delectable songs, and the difference between acute and grave accents, both in the voice and presumably in vocal music. This, I argue, is confirmed in the formulations regarding drumming with which the opening section concludes. There, Descartes sets up a contrast between two drum sounds, one created by a skin made from the hide of a sheep, and the other from the hide of a wolf. His point is that if sounded simultaneously, the latter, the wolfskin, will drown out the former, rendering the distinction between sympathy and dyspathy impossible to discern. Descartes does not linger here over the lupine and bestial figure of the sovereign, he does obsessions, but dyspathy is at stake due precisely to the sonic shadow cast by the wolfskin over that of the sheep's, and its articulation of a natural enmity. Descartes' discussion is brief, and much of it is given over to thinking about the proportions that organize the 12 tones constituting the octave in the Western musical scale. He is attuned to the impact of the minor scale on said proportions, the way it increases or decreases the interval between 6th and 7th tones in the scale, but he doesn't isolate the dyspathic character of this effect. Just the same, when later commentators note the socio-historical association of the minor with dolefulness, it is implicitly in relation to the findings schematized in the Compendium Musicae and later fleshed out as compositional strategies in Jean-Philippe Rameau's treatise on harmony. Crucial in Descartes, as I've sought to emphasize, is his stress on affect and its essential entanglements in human subjectivity. Thus, despite the disciplinary drift from philosophy to psychology, reflection on the affective significance of the minor reasserted itself in the course of the last century, beginning with Karen Hefner's 1935 study, The Affective Character of Major and Minor Modes in Music. She doesn't really mean modes, but that's okay. Conducted during her tenure in psychology at the University of Minnesota, go Gophers, Käte expressly set out to test whether then current quantitative methods in psychological research would corroborate the culturally subscribed affective associations with the modes. This is how she frames the intervention of her project. Quote, "It is an attempt to determine, one, whether the historically affirmed characteristics of the two modes are apparent to listeners, and two, if they are, to what extent the recognition of these characteristics depends on training in music, intelligence, or on the talent measured by the seashore tests," and these were specific kinds of listening tests developed to probe these kinds of pieces of evidence. She then goes on to specify the historically affirmed characteristics of the two modes. The major is associated with the following characteristics. It is dynamic, an upward driving force, it is determining and defining, and it is more natural and fundamental than the minor. For the minor, the characteristic qualities include the following. It is passive, a downward drawing weight. It is determined and defined. It expresses gloom, despair, sorrow, grief, mystery, longing, obscurity, restlessness, and the phrase that pays, melancholy. It is a mournful, dark, depressing, doleful, dull, plaintive, and soothing. End quote. Although doleful only appears in the English translation of Descartes' compendium as a rendering of the Latin treatise, it is hardly doubtful that Descartes belongs to the history that Käte is seeking to account for. In the end, she demonstrates that musical intelligence nuances while nevertheless confirming the historical record. But two lexical pairings invite commentary. The first of these strands stands forth because it is contrastively repeated in the list of characteristics. I'm thinking here of determining and defining for the major versus determined and defined for the minor. As the first listed characteristic of the minor is its passivity, this pairing underscores the activity of the major. It determines and defines, whereas the minor is determined and defined. As the major is also characterized as fundamental and natural, this distribution of activity and passivity is likewise implicitly so characterized. Since we are listing historical affirmations, the precise ontological status of the natural and of the absolutely undefined quality of activity might be regarded as dubious, if not impossible. But this sad state of affairs stands illuminated by the second pairing, which I think is worthy of commentary. I'm thinking here in Käte's description of the minor, of her evocation of the distinction between melancholia and what she calls the mournful. If I stress the immediacy of her contrast, it is to suggest that within the broad disciplinary framework of psychology, this pairing has very strong Freudian resonances. This is not because Freud, who famously insists in his correspondence that he was totally unmusical, it's not because he actually raises the problem of the minor mode in mourning and melancholia, but because he insists on that difference, specifically, and here's part of my argument, a minor difference between affects which recklessly are conflated by Käte. In this, she appears to embrace Descartes' dictum from the compendium that, quote, "That object is more easily perceived by the sense in which is found the least difference, la plus petite, the tiniest difference of parts." I will insist, actually, that we don't follow her there. She's wrong, but it's okay. It's a good opening. Three features of Freud's discussion, I think, bear repeating in this context. On the one hand, he shares the ordinary sense that melancholia is an affective state that befalls the human subject, or in his vocabulary, the ich, the ego, the I. The loss it indexes decisively darkens, there's that word, the world of the ego, prompting a withdrawal into passivity and loss of appetite. As it happens, he sounds many of Kevner's associations, inviting us to acknowledge that music generates, rather than simply represents, affect. On the other hand, unlike Kevner, Freud stresses that the mournful is different. Specifically, although it is susceptible to pathologization, it normally resolves over time. The loss it marks is psychically metabolized, signifying that the ego, upon confirming the results of reality testing and determining that the object is indeed gone, moves on. One might even be tempted here to consider that mourning is major, natural, and melancholia is, properly speaking, minor. But a different and thus third observation, I think, is called for. What is striking in Freud's paper are formulations like the following, quote, "This picture of melancholia becomes a little more intelligible when we consider that with one exception, the same traits are met with in mourning." I'm interested in this one exception. The disturbance of self-regard is absent in mourning, but otherwise the features between melancholia and mourning are the same. This initiates a series of listed samenesses. Same painful frame of mind, same loss of interest in the outside world, same loss of capacity to adopt any new object of love, same turning away from any activity that is not connected with thoughts of him. And you'll hear Connery hovering in the background here. This culminates in a rhetorical formula that crystallizes my point. The melancholic is differentiated from the mourner in knowing, quote, whom he has lost, but not what he has lost in him. Ultimately, this hair splitting, and I mean it in the best possible sense, leads Freud to a consideration of the properly ambivalent, that is, sadistic and narcissistic character of all loss. And I'll have more to say about that. But here let me simply stress that Kevner is, even if indirectly, reminding us that the minor key and the musical discourse within which it realizes its meaning affects is not just contingently relevant to human suffering and the striving for repair. If we listen to music, it is because it has, to mention Larry Kramer, it has given us our ears. Of course, Kevner's work is dated, but for that reason it seems relevant to consider what has happened to her insights in the work of someone like Richard Parnkut, whose, quote, the emotional connotations of major versus minor tonality, one or more origins, and that's the title, from 2014, explicitly takes up and extends her research. Like Kevner, Parnkut, who teaches at the University of Graz, seeks to probe the historically affirmed correlations between typical passages in major and minor keys and emotional connotations. Although he attunes to many more musical parameters than Kevner, for example, tempo and rhythm, he introduces a blunt methodological parsimony in dividing emotion from the positive and the negative. Dividing it between the positive and the negative. Once in place, this division prompts him to embellish Kevner's affective paradigms in highly evocative ways. He writes, quote, "It may seem far-fetched to apply terms like alterity or markedness to the minor mode, simply because it is less common than the major. Given that alterity and markedness also imply some form of prejudice based on category membership, we might expect something approaching discriminatory language when theorists try to explain the difference between the major and the minor." He then cites none other than von Helmholtz as confirmation of his hunch. Quote continues, "The major mode is well suited for all frames of mind that are completely formed and clearly understood, for strong resolve, for soft or gentle or even sorrowing feelings, when the sorrow has passed into the condition of dreamy yet yielding regret." but the major is quite unsuited for indistinct, obscure, unformed frames of mind, or for the expression of the dismal, the dreary, the enigmatic, the mysterious, the rude, and he gives up and says, whatever offends against artistic view. And it is precisely for these that we require the minor mode, but its veiled harmoniousness, its changeable scale, and its ready modulation are less intelligible bases for some kind of rational construction. This suggestive association of negative emotion and alterity crystallizes in Parnkot's gnomic assertion that the minor triad may also be perceived as the other, and he capitalizes other, inviting us to hear a much more politicized set of valences in his upgrade of Kevner, but valences that are also that explicitly tie the minor mode to a psychoanalytically inflected account of the listening subject. Dyspathia repeats in alterity, but in a way that associates the minor with the more narrowly melancholic sense of losing something unknown in the lost object. Something other, but something subaltern? Having himself worried about the potentially far-fetched character of his formulations, we too may hesitate at my invocation here of the subaltern. However, some reassurance is to be derived from the insistently theoretical orientation of Parnkot's study. Sharing Kevner's interest in psychology, and psychoacoustics in particular, he more insistently identifies his study as an exercise in evolutionary biology. This broadly attunes him to the notion that the human subject develops through a complex entanglement with its environment, but it also brings him around to a different perspective on the now familiar proposition about the historically affirmed affections attributed to major and minor modes. He does not see that this affirmation of history has, as it were, evolved in ways that require reflection themselves, but it does lead him to an appreciation of the arbitrariness of affect, noting that psychological associations with particular tonalities are actually quite robust in the West. He writes, given that the detailed content of musical styles and cultures is always to some extent arbitrary, the rules of consonance and dissonance in Western music may be similarly arbitrary. Does this same apply to the emotional connotations of major and minor keys? If so, the psychological question of the origins of the connotations is reduced to a historical question. Why did Western music develop such that major tonalities were usually associated with positive emotions and minor with negative? If the association is an accident of history, Western culture could have evolved in exactly the opposite way. Is that conceivable? End quote. Well, of course it is conceivable. But crucial to the task of conception is a more robust sense of the difference, or différence, as Käte would certainly insist, between history and evolution. If there is some sense that psychological valences reach more fundamentally into the historicity of the human, then the fact that the West developed tonal correlatives to these valences is a description of a process that must also include the geopolitical events whereby the West asserted not just its cultural difference, but specifically a human based on what Sylvia Wynter calls man, capital M. Here, and the point should be plain, the minor resonates in and with the sociocultural effects of subalternity. It marks the mark of alterity that the West treats as music to its ears. This leaves in suspension the matter of to what extent the minor operates outside Western tonalities, and with what political aesthetic effects. So here too, I reserve the right of return. There is, however, another aspect of this more properly geopolitical angle on the minor that calls for response. This emerges when behind or alongside my attention to Freud's exposition in Mourning and Melancholia, we notice that the minor differences separating the two states come to be thematized under the broad heading of narcissism. Specifically, what in Freud's essay on the taboo against virginity, he calls, quote, the narcissism of minor differences, end quote. As with several of his keywords from this period, Freud derives this expression from the anthropological insights of one Alfred Ernst Crawley. Writing, Crawley, in language which differs only slightly from the current terminology of psychoanalysis, declares that each individual is separated from the others by a taboo of personal isolation, and that it is precisely the minor differences in people who are otherwise alike that form the basis of strangeness and hostility between them. It would be tempting to pursue this idea and to derive from this narcissism of minor differences the hostility which in every human relation we are fighting successfully against feelings of fellowship and overpowering in all of us the commandment that we love one another. Ajay is going to come back to this problem of loving the neighbor. 12 years later, on the pages of Civilization and its Discontent, he succumbs to this temptation he mentions, saying, it's always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. I once discussed the phenomenon that it is precisely communities with adjoining territories, and related to each other in other ways as well, who engage in constant feuds and ridiculing each other, like the Spaniards and the Portuguese, for instance, the Northern Germans and the Southern Germans, the English and the Scotch, he says Scotch, and so on. I gave this phenomenon the name of narcissism of minor differences, a name that does not do so much to explain it, however. As my epigraph from Bouts reminds us, Freud again retrieves this formulation in his account of the Egyptian origin of Western monotheism. Although it's difficult to avoid recognizing the extent to which minor differences are here being linked to the psychosocial dynamics of conflict, it's actually equally difficult to overlook the fact that in German, the minor mode is typically rendered as das Moll, where minor, as in lesser, is typically rendered as klein, or small. Indeed, in Freud's text, what appears in the English translation as minor difference is derived from the German kleine Differenz. Or more literally, I think, small, and maybe even at best, smallest difference. However, the terms associatively converge when small finds mild in the Latin mollis. But more to the point is the quality of the difference that Freud teases out of Crawley's English. And I should say here too, I'm interested in thinking about the minor quantitatively, but also qualitatively, and what's going on there. The difference in entangling love and aggression is ambivalent. The very quality that surfaced in Freud's account of melancholia and prompted him to stress the narcissistic character of a wound inflicted by a loss that extends from an object to a survivor. Melancholia is thus properly ambivalent, and if it is a fitting association with the affect produced by the minor mode, as Kepler and Parkett have attested, it's because the mode is itself differentiated from the major by what deserves to be called a minor difference, the smallest interval or even semitone. The keys are largely identical, except for a note that is flatted or sharp, depending upon what minor we're talking about. But something else in Freud's formulations, I think, call for response. When, as is stressed, he writes, quote, Crawleyan language, which differs only slightly from the current terminology of psychoanalysis, declares that each individual is separated from the others by a taboo of personal isolation, and, quote, that it is precisely the minor differences in people who are otherwise alike that form the basis of strangeness and hostility between them, and quote, Freud repeats a gesture noted before, and I'm thinking of his description of melancholia, where he writes, quote, this picture of melancholia becomes a little more intelligible when we consider that, with one exception, the same traits are met with in mourning. This triggers a listing of samenesses, as I noted before. What is so striking here is the way the narcissistic motif of the minor difference operates to, on the one hand, connect Freud and Crowley. Their language differs only slightly, and on the other, to connect normal mourning and pathological melancholia. Only one exception differentiates the two. What's going on here? To respond to this only slightly rhetorical question, consider that Freud is here, as elsewhere, worrying over the status of the truth claims advanced by psychoanalysis. Does his science know anything? This worry manifests as a certain anxiety about the extent to which the commonalities between psychoanalysis and other fields of inquiry within the human sciences secure or compromise its metapsychological propositions. Useful here is the elaboration of particulars. In this case, differences between affective states, whether they're known better by Freud or Crowley. But complicating everything is the striking parallelism between inquiry and its objects, both exemplifying the quality of minor differences. Taken far enough, the parallel invites the conclusion that the point at which psychoanalytical proposition rings true is not when that proposition corresponds with its object, but when it and its object enter into a state, at once ontological and epistemological, of radical ambivalence. Put another way, what emerges here is a meta-theoretical meditation on the nature of theory itself, a theme that has figured prominently in my own reflections about tuning. Stimmung being a concept through which phenomenology has reflected on the conditions of the possibility for science as such. Where and when do knowledge and world converge, if they can at all? At the risk of adding insult to injury, at least as concerns the demands I'm placing on you, my listeners, I will insist that this isn't really a digression. This is not a wandering off or away from the problem of the minor. To recognize this, recall that along various fronts we've entertained the relation between the minor and melancholia, a relation whose history invites, even demands, I think, additional commentary. In 1938, Melanie Klein read before a meeting of the International Psychoanalytical Association, the IPA, a paper titled Mourning and its Relation of Manic Depressive States. A paper developed out of a slightly earlier contribution on the matter of manic depression, and one whose title leaves no doubt as to which of Freud's concepts it seeks to engage. Its substitution of manic depressive states for melancholia crystallizes a certain historical tendency begun explicitly in Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholia, but brought to culmination in Emile Kreplin's Noseology from the end of the 19th century. At issue is the relation, and not merely terminological, between melancholia and depression. In Klein's paper, she sides with those inclined toward this substitution and advances at least two important metapsychological innovations. On the one hand, her work with children has led her to root pathological mourning in her understandings of ontogeny. That is, if melancholia could fix and thus complicate normal mourning, this was because a feature of normal mourning already inclined toward melancholia, in effect predating and predisposing the condition. On the other hand, to capitalize on this innovation, it was crucial to substitute manic depression for melancholia, whence the title of her intervention, and to discover within the former something she wanted to call a depressive position. That is, a structural instability that exposed the mourner both to depression but also significantly to the potentiality for repair, for reparation, one of Klein's insistent preoccupations, through a love fueled but unfettered by narcissism. The relevance of this largely academic observation for thinking the minor emerges when we note an attempt to access the fact that these very essays of Klein's came to figure centrally in Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's confrontation with what had been called the school of suspicion.
They're not here for you.
Did you hear what I just read?
I just
the school of suspicion. In her brilliant chapter, Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or, comma, you're so paranoid you probably think this essay is about you, from Touching Feeling in 2002. Her title, An Unmistakable Displacement of Carly Simon, makes it clear that she seeks to capitalize on Klein's exploration of depression and reparation. But with what precise impact on the putative school of suspicion? Technically, this school's founding was hinted at on the pages of Hans-Georg Gadamer's 1960 publication, Truth and Method, where faith and suspicion were contrasted as modes of hermeneutical understanding. In a nutshell, was textual interpretation even possible if access to meaning itself was in doubt? The school was named as such by Paul Ricoeur during the prestigious Terry lectures he gave at Yale in 1961, lectures that 4 years later appeared in his study, Freud and Philosophy. At issue here was a point long belabored by Lacan, namely that to appreciate the significance of psychoanalysis, one had to appreciate the status of language within it. Put differently, what was interesting about the unconscious was not its contents, but its effects on language, and thus the subject's relation to speech. Ricoeur recognized that the speaking subject's relation to language had emerged since Friedrich Schleiermacher's work as the central question of hermeneutics, and that Freud had to be appreciated within this broadly philosophical context. But more influentially still, Ricoeur insisted that Freud be grouped with Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche as figures who demanded that we approach texts suspiciously. That is, acutely sensitive to the fact that they could not say what they meant because of distortions introduced into them by the unconscious, by ideology, or by the will. Although she does not mention it, Foucault's Nietzsche, Freud, Marx from 1964 must also be seen as part of the integration, the inauguration of the school of suspicion that Sedgwick and subsequently Rita Felsky have cast in the role of founding the now dominant practice of cultural interpretation in the West. We wish that it was the now dominant. But texts are routinely to be brushed against their grains because each in their own way is hiding something it is the destiny of criticism to unveil. It is in this sense that Sedgwick is characterizing the entirety of contemporary critical theory as paranoid. This transposition would appear to have two purposes. It shifts the discussion of Freud away from the theory of the unconscious and toward the theory of sexuality. And, in displacing suspicion, it sifts for those critical currents concerned to doubt the power of their own acts of unveiling. In shifting attention within the Freudian corpus, Klein's work enters the frame and incites Sedgwick's speculations about modes of interpretation, reading, that are less concerned with disclosing the wounds structuring the text, and more immediately concerned with the text's reparative potential, its capacity to compensate for the work of distortion and gesture toward what might heal it. Massive issues loom here, for example, the implication for contemporary politics of reparations or reparative justice of Sedgwick's notion of reparative reading. But what bears particular emphasis is that the series, Melancholia, Depression, Reparation, all nudge the consideration of the minor very directly toward a question about the tone and orientation of critical hermeneutics as such. Although their angles are all but incompatible, Sedgwick's embrace of depressive positions, precisely in their plurality, depressive positions, resonates with Gilles Deleuze's provocative characterization of philosophy in his early study of Nietzsche, where he writes, and you know this line very well, "Philosophy does not serve the state or the church, who have other concerns. It serves no established power. The use of philosophy is to sadden. A philosophy that saddens no one, that annoys no one, is not philosophy." Deleuze has other things to say about la tristesse, especially in conjunction with the passions as elaborated by Spinoza, but his implicit retrieval here of Descartes' embrace of the Latin triste invites one to hear in the depressive displacement of melancholia an acute amplification of the range of the minor. In a book dedicated to Nietzsche, one is inclined to read an additional displacing of the tragic by sadness, where the latter designates the prerogative philosophy once it has, out of the spirit of music, remember the subtitle, promulgated the dissipation of tragedy. Regardless, if the affect tone of sadness, depression, melancholia is now what Western thought sounds like, then might we not argue that the difference of or in the minor has prevailed? It gives affective contour to human struggle and practice, especially as it manifests in the intellectual labor of what deserves to be called critique, reparative or otherwise. Perhaps all the work songs of the spirit are in a minor key. Among the several things to which one might object in such a thought experiment is the simple fact that Sedgwick appears to have no interest in music, whether in a major or minor key. As her extended references to Proust implies, she has, of course, awareness of the Vinteuil sonata that wafts through the search for lost time, but she does not hearken to it. Its significance for Swann is mentioned in her posthumous The Weather in Proust, but it is hardly used. That said, it is not entirely accidental, I should think, that a song figures prominently in her title. As I've noted, Sedgwick launches her repudiation of the school of suspicion, its paranoia, by tweaking Carly Simon's You're So Vain, wherein among its many effects is to be found its evocation of narcissism just off stage with the classical Western motif of vanitas. A substantial part of Sedgwick's critique of suspicion, and therefore of melancholia, is her sense of the grim continuity of its variations. The fact that it feels like a stage, not a position, not a standpoint, from which a critical observation might be launched. The minor here is merely and resolutely doleful. But perhaps then it is not entirely irrelevant that You're So Vain, at least as recorded on her album Secrets, moves directly from Klaus Fuhrmann's wounded bass intro into a chord pattern that falls comfortably into the key of C major. Whether Sedgwick knows this or not, what she is associating with her rejection of melancholia is precisely a major tonality, as if to underscore the otherwise distinctly minor character of sadness, of the doleful, of critique that has doubts, maybe even repudiates its own restorative powers. Now this brings the minor back into contact with the problem of immanent critique, and as is noted earlier, the tension between the minor and the subaltern has two ways to effectively figure the means by which an order thinks the critical force of what it inclusively excludes. If the minor speaks, if it sounds, in what voicing does it do so? And are we waiting for it to sound, or is it already part of the very texture of ambience in the present? A final allusion will help answer these questions, an allusion that obliges us to consider how Afrikaans matters to and within the politics of the minor as formulated in A Thousand Plateaux. In 2023, we lost the Canadian musician, public health advocate, and theorist, R. Murray Schafer, whose 1977 text, The Soundscape, Our Sonic Environment and the Tuning of the World, now stands as a founding formulation within the field of sound studies. Although controversial among Schafer's theoretical musings is the proposition that in order for the onslaught of global noise to be countered, if not reversed, a critical vocabulary must be elaborated to describe and thus materialize what he calls the sonic environment. I have elsewhere noted that this shifts attention from the problem of hearing loss to listening loss, in stressing the essential role of sense in the event of sound reception. Be that as it may, what invites attention in the context that I'm trying to produce is Schafer's descriptive category of what he calls the keynote. In the Soundscape text, this is what he says about it. Keynote is a musical term. It is the note that identifies the key or tonality of a particular composition. It is the anchor or fundamental tone, although the material may modulate around it, often obscuring its importance. It is in reference to this point that everything else takes on its special meaning. Keynote sounds do not have to be listened to consciously. They are overheard, but cannot be overlooked. For keynotes become listening habits in spite of themselves. Even though keynote sounds may not always be heard consciously, the fact that they are ubiquitously there suggests the possibility of a deep and pervasive influence on our behavior and our moods. You use stimming to get at mood here. The keystone sounds of a given place are important because they help to outline the character of men living among them, the character of men. In a subsequent formulation, he notes that the unconscious perception of keynotes and his several references to Freud in the text establish the simple rigor of this terminology, forges a distinctive tie between them and change, much as we might notice a key change or modulation from C major to its relative minor in A in a favorite song. The force of this insight intensifies when we appreciate the parallel Schafer is drawing between the way key operates musically. In his formulation, he's describing the operational value of the tonic note in Western tonalities and its status as an element in a soundscape. It will come then as no surprise that I read Schafer as inviting us to attend to the significance of the difference between a major and minor keynote, and more broadly, the significance of the sort of keynote change that might be effective through the imposition of a colonial regime, whether as a built environment or as a bureaucratic lingua franca, or both. Because the keynote changes that attract Schafer are typically epic in proportion, the shift from agrarian to industrial production, for example, he misses changes wrought by empire, and thus, despite his status as an Anglophone Canadian working at a university situated directly on unceded indigenous lands. What this implies is that leading tones, and one of the distinctive features of the harmonic minor, one of the two types of the minor, is that it is designed to highlight the narrative gesture of homecoming, the returning to the tonic note in a scale. Leading tones lead to a changed home. Under such circumstances, the right of return becomes an affective issue. It makes sensible a depressive position from which and in relation to which mourning is possible. Sadness is possible. Listening can be listened to. Consider then from this angle what Deleuze and Guattari have to say about the status of Afrikaans in the history of South Africa. Their discussion, and it's barely that, is suggestively mediated through a translation. specifically Georges-Marie Laurie's French rendition of Breitenbach's collection of poems, Gangrene in English, Feu Froid in French. How precisely Breitenbach comes to matter to them is left unstated. But due to his visa struggles with Pretoria, especially once he married a Vietnamese woman, Breitenbach took up residence in France and quickly became involved with the Okaheli group in Paris. Introduced to Marxist theory through Gianni Macchittini, among others, Breitenbach was interested in precisely the kind of conceptual probing of Marxism that nudged Guattari toward the Italian autonomist Marxism animated by Negri's reading of Marx and the strong preference for the Grundrisse over Capital. As the title in Afrikaans might imply, this collection of poems was written in Afrikaans, but read by Deleuze and Guattari in French translation. Indeed, they concentrate on the short section written by Laurie, the translator, commenting on the work. It is here that Laurie invokes the metaphor of the bastard to characterize translation in general. In earlier gesturing toward this material, I stressed its relation to their discussion of Quebecois French, where they sought to put pressure on its status as a minor language. They extended this point in commenting on the status of Afrikaans as a minor language, noting that while it emerges as a minor language in its encounter with what they call the Bantu dialects of South Africa, it quickly stabilizes, both in relation to English and to indigenous tongues, drifting audibly toward majority. One is reminded here of Deleuze's subsequent perorations on the vicious smallness of majority, and he sees this as evidenced in Breitenbach's book of poetry. In their discussion of Quebecois French, such observations lead to the proposition that given the deftness of these differences, at once conceptual and acoustic, linguistics ought properly cede authority to musicology when seeking to account for them. They do not invoke the concept of minor difference, but could it fit? Subtle but decisive changes are happening as Afrikaans enters into national circulation, and it is precisely this that Schaeffer draws attention to when thinking about the way a lived space resonates perceptibly with a different keynote. That keynote, like any note, is comprised and composed of frequencies, an ordered heterogeneity that tells us where we are. Are we then dealing with what Sedgwick might urge us to call a depressive and thus reparative keynote? And specifically in the South African context. If so, how do we recognize what it, as it were, sounds like? As Deleuze and Guattari caution, the keynote cannot merely register the becoming major of Afrikaans, but nor can it listen for the minor in the more dominant sites of contrasting indigeneity. Perhaps the keynote does not sound as a home, as a tonic, but as a destination in flight, a being on the way that manifests more insistently in the minor differences that in articulating languages, landscapes, and musics hold open a space, a moment where sadness is at work executing the troubling aim of philosophy. When we invoke the critical value and power of the subaltern to think the progressive potential of the present, the major difference it seeks to theorize only makes it more difficult to attend to what resonates, however intermittently, in the minor, as in the depressive sadness of our keynote. And keynote, of course, refers to me. We need to prick our ears differently. In fact, we may need to hearken to the suggestion made now 50 years ago by Bout when he and Roland Havas urged that we consider the common ground between humans and other animals, in that form of listening that attends to the alert. This is the form of listening that sorts between sound and source by seeking to identify what is approaching. Only for us, what is approaching is what our gestures of reparation are, in fact, bringing to us. This composition, whose copyright is held in common, may well be technically the only sad song left. Thank you.
Thank you for that keynote. You know, this is why we call you a brother with the perfect timing. Thank goodness we didn't have Carly Simon all the way to Tinsa. But John, thank you very much. That was, superb. I'm going to open up for questions, comments, ruminations.